There is a name for what has been keeping you in the wrong career, and it is not a character flaw. It's not insufficient desire, or cowardice, or a failure of discipline. It's a documented cognitive mechanism, one that researchers have been studying for decades across economics, psychology, and behavioral science. And once you understand exactly how it works, not in the abstract, but in the specific way it operates inside a career you've built over years, the paralysis starts to make a different kind of sense. Not the kind of sense that lets you off the hook, the kind that lets you finally work with what's actually happening, instead of fighting a version of yourself that was never the problem. That's where this video was going. And that's the only promise worth making here. By the end of this, you'll have the name. And you'll understand why having the name is not enough, and what is. Start with the basic mechanism, because most people have heard the term and think they understand it. Status quo bias is not a preference for comfort. That's how it gets explained in most places, and that explanation is almost useless, because it implies the solution is just to get more comfortable with discomfort. That is not what the research shows. Status quo bias, as defined in behavioral economics, is the disproportionate weight the brain assigns to the current state of affairs when evaluating any decision involving change. Not a slight preference, a disproportionate one. In their foundational research, Kahneman and Tversky found that losses feel roughly twice as painful as equivalent gains feel good, which means in any decision where you might lose something, and a career change is almost always framed as a decision where you might lose something, your brain is not evaluating the options equally. It is running an asymmetric calculation. The potential loss gets double the psychological weight of the potential gain before you've consciously decided anything. This is loss aversion, and it sits at the core of status quo bias. But here's where it gets specific to careers, and where most explanations stop too early. Status quo bias doesn't just make change feel costly. It makes the current situation feel increasingly valuable the longer you've been in it. Behavioral economists call this the endowment effect. The longer you own something, the more you value it. Not because it has become more valuable, but because your brain has begun to treat it as part of you. The job title, the salary band, the professional reputation you spent years building in this specific context. Your brain has endowed all of it, which means it is not evaluating your career options the way a rational outside observer would. It is protecting what it has already claimed as yours. That's the diagnosis. And it's more specific than fear of change. Here is what the standard explanation of status quo bias misses, and why understanding it in other contexts hasn't helped you move in this one. Career decisions are not just subject to status quo bias. They are one of the domains where the bias runs hardest because three specific amplifiers are almost always present. The first is identity fusion. In most decisions affected by status quo bias, which insurance plan to keep, which neighborhood to stay in, your sense of who you are is not directly on the line. In a career, it almost always is. Research on professional identity consistently shows that high-achieving adults in specialized roles fuse their self-concept with their professional role more completely than in almost any other life domain. Which means when your brain evaluates, should I leave this career, it is not just evaluating a job, it is evaluating a partial amputation of identity. The cognitive cost of that evaluation is not proportional to the actual decision. It is enormous, and it activates loss aversion at a depth that most career advice never accounts for. The second amplifier is sunk cost architecture. Every year in a role adds more justification for staying. The certifications, the institutional knowledge, the relationships that took half a decade to build, the expertise that only has full market value in this context. Sunk cost thinking is irrational. Behavioral economists establish that definitively. But knowing that doesn't make it stop working, because the brain doesn't experience sunk costs as logical errors, it experiences them as evidence. Evidence that leaving would mean all of that was wasted. And the longer you've been in the role, the larger that evidence file becomes, and the more rational staying appears, even as the actual experience of staying grows worse. This is the part that matters. The smarter you are about what you've built, the more detailed your inventory of what you'd be leaving behind. Intelligence doesn't protect you from status quo bias in careers. It makes the bias more articulate, more sophisticated in its justifications, more capable of producing genuinely convincing reasons why this is not the right time, why the market isn't ready, why one more year makes more sense. The third amplifier is what this channel calls protective ambiguity. As long as you haven't tried to build something different, the possibility exists that you could. That version of you, the one who makes the change, who builds the thing, who becomes the person you thought you'd be, is still structurally alive. The moment you actually try, that protection ends. If it works, the question resolves. If it doesn't, if the attempt produces evidence that the risk wasn't worth it, that the new direction didn't deliver what you hoped, you have something you didn't have before. Permanent, difficult to reframe evidence about your own capabilities. Staying keeps that evidence from ever being created, not because you're naive, because you're protecting something that matters to you more than most people around you understand. Here is where the career version of this bias diverges from almost every other domain it appears in. In most decisions, status quo bias is a one-time calculation. You evaluate the options, the bias weights them asymmetrically, you stay, and the decision closes. In a career, the calculation doesn't close. It reopens every performance review cycle. Every birthday that arrives with the question of where you thought you'd be by now. Every LinkedIn notification about a peer who took the risk you've been postponing. Every Sunday evening, reliably, around 8 p.m., each time the decision reopens, the bias runs again. And here is what makes this structurally different from a one-time decision. Every year of inaction produces more material for the bias to work with. More sunk costs, more identity fusion, more institutional history, more to lose, more evidence that the current situation, however wrong it feels, is at least known, and that the alternative is still uncharted. The mechanism feeds itself. The bias that made leaving feel costly in year 3 makes it feel more costly in year 5, more costly still in year 7. Not because the actual cost has increased, because the brain's inventory of what it's protecting has grown, and the loss aversion calculation runs on that inventory. This is why the people who feel most trapped are often the people who have built the most. It is not a cruel irony. It is the precise, predictable output of a documented mechanism. And here is the insight that this channel considers the most important thing in this entire video. Status quo bias does not respond to desire. It does not respond to clarity about what's wrong. It does not respond to information about what's possible. It does not respond to how badly you want things to be different. The research on this is consistent and has been replicated across decision domains for 40 years. Motivation does not counter status quo bias. Structure does. That distinction is everything, because it means the years of wanting to change and not changing were not evidence of insufficient desire. They were evidence that desire was never the lever. The mechanism has a name now, and named things are navigable in ways that unnamed things aren't. If what this video is describing is true, that the bias doesn't move with motivation, only with structure, then what you need next is not more understanding of the problem. It's an external system that moves without requiring internal drive to be sustained. The 90-day transition blueprint in the description was built for exactly that. A week-by-week structure calibrated for people who are still employed, still carrying financial obligations, and need a system that moves independently of whether any given week feels like the right week to act. The link is in the description and the pinned comment. So what does actually interrupt it? Not willpower, not a vision board, not a conversation with yourself about how badly you want this. Behavioral economists studying status quo bias across financial, medical, and professional decisions found 2 categories of intervention that consistently work. The first is commitment devices. A commitment device is any structure that makes the default option harder to maintain without requiring a new decision each time. The classic example from retirement research. Automatic enrollment changed retirement savings rates more dramatically than any financial education program because it shifted the default. Instead of choosing to save, people had to choose not to. In a career context, this looks like a scheduled monthly financial audit, a standing conversation with someone outside your company, a committed hour per week, not when you feel ready, but in the calendar, recurring, non-negotiable, to build something parallel to the current role. The commitment device doesn't require you to feel motivated. It requires you to actively opt out, and most people don't. The second category is friction asymmetry. Status quo bias is, at its core, a friction problem. The current situation has low friction. You know how it works. You know what's expected. The path of least resistance runs directly through it. The alternative has high friction, uncertainty, unknown processes, new relationships to build, a learning curve that costs time you don't feel you have. Research on behavior change consistently shows that reducing friction on the desired behavior works more reliably than increasing motivation to overcome it, which means the question is not, how do I want this more? The question is, what is one piece of friction I can remove from the path I actually want to be on? This week, specifically with the time and access I actually have. Not a leap. Not a bet. Not a signal to anyone that anything is changing. A small, specific, low-friction move that the bias has less material to resist because it costs less than the threshold where loss aversion activates at full force. This is how the mechanism gets interrupted, not overcome in a single decision. Interrupted repeatedly, structurally, deliberately, until the new path has enough momentum that the bias calculation starts to shift. That is what a controlled exit actually looks like. Not a leap. A series of engineered interruptions, and the people who have done it, people with mortgages, with dependents, with careers that took 15 years to build, did not do it because they found the courage that you haven't found yet. They did it because they stopped trying to generate the courage and started building the structure instead. If the structure is what you're missing, not the understanding, but the week-by-week system that moves without requiring a perfect week to run it, the 90-day transition blueprint in the description is the next step. Link is in the description and in the pinned comment. When you look back at the moments you almost made a move, what specifically stopped you? Not the surface reason, the one underneath it. You came to this video carrying something that has probably been described to you by yourself more than by anyone else as a lack of follow-through. A gap between knowing and doing that you've spent years trying to close with more knowing, more videos, more frameworks, more clarity about the problem. And every time the gap didn't close, the explanation your brain offered was the same one. You don't want it badly enough. Other people who made this change had something you don't have. Something essential and probably innate that allows them to act when you can't. What this video has offered instead is this: the gap between knowing and doing in this specific domain for people in this specific situation is not a motivation gap. It is a structure gap. The bias doesn't yield to desire. It yields to commitment devices and reduced friction, to systems that move independently of how any given Tuesday feels, which means you are not someone who lacks what it takes. You are someone who has been trying to solve a structure problem with a motivation solution and wondering why it keeps not working. That is not a character diagnosis. That is a method error, and method errors are correctable. The years you spent in the wrong role were not years of choosing inaction. They were years of a mechanism operating exactly as designed on a brain that is, if anything, more susceptible to it because of how seriously you've taken what you've built. You were right about what you were capable of. The bias just had more material to work with than most people acknowledge. Understanding the mechanism is not the exit, but it is the thing that changes what you reach for next. Not more motivation. Not a better argument with yourself on a Sunday evening. Structure. Commitment. Friction removed from the path you actually want to be on. The mechanism has a name now. That name is not your character. It is a documented cognitive pattern that responds to a specific kind of intervention, not someone else's version of that intervention. Yours.